we must raise a community of believers united in purpose and pursuit, seeking to carry out Jesus' command to the letter. We need church leaders who understand the very heart of the Great Commission. Now, that is a quote from the introduction of the State of the Great Commission report produced by the Lausanne Movement, which is the topic of this edition of PEP Talk, the Persuasive Evangelism podcast from SOLAS. Welcome to the show. I am Simon Wenham, and I'm really looking forward to discussing what is a very important and interesting study for Christians today. And to help me do that, I'm joined by my intrepid co-presenter, Gavin Matthews. Gavin, how are you doing today?
Do very well, Simon. It's nice to be back on. I've not been on the podcast for a couple of months, so lovely to be back on.
Great. Well, it's lovely to have you. I use the word intrepid because, as some people may know, you've recently cycled the entire length of Britain, and so that which does beg the question is: have you suitably recovered yet?
Several parts of my anatomy have some recovery still to do.
Okay, well, we won't go any further with that, but moving swiftly on. I'm also delighted to introduce our main guest today, who is Dr. Matthew Niermann, the Director of Global Research at the Lausanne Movement. This is a very important global evangelical collaboration that has been encouraging mission across the world over the past 50 years. And he's speaking to us today in his position as executive editor of the State of the Great Commission report. And I should also add that he's a professor of architecture at California Baptist University. And he's also written on many other subjects, including Christian creativity and beauty. So I'm sorry we can't cover those topics, but it's very interesting to know that you're covering other areas as well as global mission. So, Dr. Niermann, welcome to the show. I wondered if you could just start by saying a little bit about your own background and perhaps how you got involved with evangelism in the first place.
Yeah, thank you, gentlemen. It's great to be here today. Wonderful to be here on PEP Talk with you guys. Absolutely love discussing this and really encouraging all Christians to engage in the Great Commission. So, as you said, Simon, I've had a bit of an interesting background, right? I sit both with a hat as an architecture professor, buildings, not computers, for those who are in both fields. But then I also sit in the mission side. And to me, these are worlds that come together. As I began to really live out my faith in my college years and post-college years, and even in my young faculty years, I recognized that how I was presenting the gospel, really truth-heavy, hitting truth, wasn't matching or wasn't landing in the context where I was at. So I began to understand the role, to your point, my other kind of area of research, the role that beauty plays in showing who God is and showing what the gospel is in people's lives. And I began to understand that there are multiple avenues to speak who God is to this world. And that led me down lots of different paths as I continued to actively pursue evangelism in both beauty and design, and then followed up with missions research and formal training as a missiologist, and thinking more and more about how this can work. And I've been faithfully with Lausanne Movement for about 15 years now, and enjoying both the formal side of Lausanne research and the practice of missions and evangelism and apologetics through beauty.
Brings us to this great report that's come out in the last few months called The State of the Great Commission. Why did you set about doing this major piece of research, and what does it bring? What does it bring to the church?
Yeah, thanks. This is a once-in-a-generation report. This is a 550-page report, the 150 authors, 100 pages of original graphs and diagrams. And this was a major undertaking, as you said, Gavin. But this was an important undertaking. This aligned with the Seoul 2024 Congress, where we brought the world together in Lausanne, which happens once a generation, to say, here's where we are at in the Great Commission, and how do we advance the Great Commission? So aligned with that global Congress, we produced a report that says, where are we in the Great Commission? How is it that we can begin to advance the Great Commission in our day and in our age? So it was a mark in the sand, Gavin. It was a point in time that says, here's where we are, and taking on this audacious question of where are we in the Great Commission? That took about 550 pages and probably another 1,000 pages after that. But it's a big question to ask where we are in the Great Commission.
Fantastic. Thank you. And I must say, I really enjoyed looking through it. There's so much interesting information. It really was just a sort of a hive of interesting facts about the church, and also just very, very helpful for us in mission and evangelism. I suppose the sort of summary question is what are some of the major findings of the report? Obviously, the world is a very different place from where it was even a couple of decades ago.
Yeah, it's amazing to think the last time we did a report like this was in 2010. Now here we are in 2025, just how radically our world has shifted in those years. We begin to look at where is the church now. We can look at it from a couple different ways. We can begin to look at where is the world, right? The world's in a very different place. Each one of you are probably listening to this on a cell phone while driving, and maybe a self-driving car, right? That didn't exist in 2010 when we did this before. We're looking at radical demographic shifts inside and outside of the church and how our world is being shaped. Looking at economic changes from the middle class to the rich. We're looking at age demographics changing. There's a whole slew of things that are, and even new questions that are coming up within this. So the report is framed in 10 major questions that are shaping the world between now and 2050, and in a sense will shape our Great Commission as well.
That's really interesting because very often guests come on this podcast particularly, and they talk about evangelism, the Great Commission at a micro level. We have people working in their neighborhoods or in a school. And yet on this edition, we're kind of pulling back and looking at the global picture. So what are some snapshots from all of that research and those 10 big questions, particularly in terms of the implications for evangelism, the implications for us as the church as we go about world mission? I mean, you mentioned things like demographic shifts, aging, those sorts of things. What does it mean for us as we engage as a world church in mission?
Yeah, I think one of the main parts and maybe dispositions that I would want a reader to come to this report with and leave with is this idea that we have to know the world so that Christ can be known by the world. So oftentimes in our mission studies, we look at ourselves, we look at the church, we see what's going on within the Christian world. But this report lifts our eyes up and says, look beyond the church, look into the world. How is the world right now? Where is it going so that we can begin to meet the world where it's at in a contextualized gospel way? So I'm happy to kind of unpack some of these questions. Maybe what was most interesting to you guys in here that we could talk about a little bit further.
Thank you. I mean, there were so many different sort of themes that run throughout it. I mean, the demographic shift was one of them. I think one thing that I noticed, which I thought was quite interesting, is talking about actually the an older demographic getting larger in the world today. And I thought that was quite interesting because we sometimes think of the church as being in decline because it is elderly and perhaps isn't being replaced. And I suppose that raised the question of, do you are you advocating sort of certain types of mission for different demographics with regard to, potentially elderly people or other demographics as well?
Yeah, certainly. And it's important to note that we are thinking about what's happening in the church and outside the church. If we look at both of those, actually, Simon, we can see that across the world, we're just getting older. The majority of the population in most places, save a few places, right? Africa is a very young continent and others. But if you look at the West and you look at Asia, we're primarily a very old and getting older kind of population. Now, this has a lot of effects on how we consider missions and evangelism, both in proclamation and in service. If we think about just how our country's infrastructures are going to need to change, our healthcares, our service industries, just the secular side of things have to radically shift. And there's a great opportunity in there for the church to come alongside and serve our elderly population and care for them. But it's also interesting when you begin to look at the discipleship and effectiveness of discipleship to the elderly populations. Guys, we do a really wonderful job focusing on youth. Most of our churches have youth pastors. Most of our churches have youth outreach. Most of our churches have youth engagement. But we've had very little consideration on aging engagement, aging discipleship, aging evangelism. And this is a major population shift that's happening in our world. And so maybe if we think about even our own church, we can say, why is it that we have a youth minister, but we don't have an aging minister? These are interesting kind of notions. If the majority of our population is here and not there, it's just a gut check question for us to say, why is it that we're doing this? And perhaps we could help and aid and serve and disciple this population even more.
I'm interrupting this edition of the PEP Talk podcast to tell you that Solas is about to celebrate its 15th birthday. And you're invited to come and join us at 7:30 p.m. on Wednesday, the 19th of November, online. To access that, go to solas-cpc.org/15. That's the word 15, not the digits. Come and join us as we celebrate 15 years of Solas and look to the future. See you there. And now, back to the podcast. I think sometimes the church, well, certainly where I live, we could be quite introspective. We don't look much beyond the boundaries of our own country. Is that typical of the world church, or are we uniquely introspective? And how can we grow more in our consciousness of being part of a global movement of Christians seeking to carry out the Great Commission?
Yeah, Gavin, I think this is common amongst all. Really great Christian organizations are doing what they do very well. And they do it very well because their head is looking at head is down, let's say, looking at what they do and how they do it. You guys have an amazing podcast because you're focusing on your podcast and curating and doing well. And it's a great service to the church, but it's head down. And that's okay. It takes rare moments where you can look up and look beyond your organization, look beyond your country and say, this is what's happening in the world. And that's the heart of this report. We did the heavy work, the heavy lifting to say, hey, world, look up. Here's what's happening. Here's what's going on in the world. And that can be useful. Remember, Gavin, I think it's even useful to think of just very basic facts of Christianity in and of itself. If you look at the change in Christianity between 1900 and now, we're in a radically different world. You guys are there in the UK. And you can think in 1900s, the bulk of Christianity was sitting in the West. It was sitting in Europe. And you could say the average Christian, let's say, as a stereotype, would be a white European male in 1800s. You radically move to now all the way to 2050, and the 80% of the world of Christians that were in the West has flipped to 80% of the Christians in the world are in not the West. To the point now where the average Christian, or the stereotypical Christian, is probably a Nigerian female, is the best way to think about that. And so as we begin to think about what we're doing in our own country, we have to recognize the global body of Christianity has radically. So just one example there, Gavin, right? But as we can begin to think like who we're serving and who are our brothers and sisters in the world, looking up does great for us.
Thank you. Yeah, I found that particularly interesting, the sort of stress on Christianity to be polycentric, as in not centered, and also not centered where perhaps we necessarily think it is, as we think a lot of the church revolves around sort of people like us in our particular area. I mean, I think when it comes to the sort of broadening the horizons, one of the other themes was that obviously we live in a digital age, as you mentioned, and you mentioned Christians had tried to transcend digital borders and not just to chase popularity, for example. So I wondered if you could say a little bit about what you see as some of the opportunities and perhaps challenges of living in this sort of increasingly connected but digital world.
The fact that we live in a digital age is one of the most radical shifts in our world since 2010, when we looked at this last. The fact that most of our time is spent online or in front of screens, the fact that 56% of the world is regularly on digital media and social media throughout each day. If you do any global demographic, there's not a single demographic where you get 56% of the world doing anything. Right? We're looking at close to 60% of the world on social media and digital tech. So there's actually been lots of commentary on social media impact and how do we engage via social media. But here's what I want to say about this, Simon. As we begin to think about evangelism and Great Commission work specifically in the digital age, I think we have to recognize that perhaps we haven't thought as deeply as we could about this. So let's take our last idea about British individuals going to Africa right in the 1900s and beginning to evangelize there. This was an amazing time where people went, moved their family, crossed a physical boundary, learned a new language, wore a different dress, began to contextualize the gospel for a different population with hopes that it would be heard by that population. However, when we're in the digital age, we rarely take that level and depth of contextualization seriously. We are accustomed to crossing physical barriers, but not quite as accustomed to being intentional crossing digital barriers. Oftentimes, the content we produce is by Christians, for Christians, only in that digital algorithm coming to that person. But it takes a lot of effort to intentionally look different, dress different, talk different, to cross an algorithmic boundary or a digital boundary to then reach a different population there. I think we're expecting to kind of produce Christian content with how we look and exactly how we act and hope that the non-Christian receives it. In the same way that didn't work in 1900, that's not going to work here in 2025 in our digital world. So I think there's some depth of contextualization and crossing digital boundaries that we can still grow in.
I think we're finding it harder now. In fact, I think 10 years ago, it was very easy to cross the boundaries, but the pay-to-play model of the algorithms on social media is siloing people into kind of like little echo chambers, and it's taking more and more effort, I think, to get our content designed for non-Christian people across those boundaries, and it's something we're working hard on, but it's becoming, I think, increasingly challenging. Is that a reasonable response?
I think so. I see the same thing.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, you have people writing this report from all over the world. You've got, was it 150 authors? So you've got people in all sorts of cultures. But my eye obviously went to the UK, where I am. And I was struck by something in there that Simon actually highlighted as well when he was reading it, about low levels of trust in institutions. That was one of the standout stats here in the UK. We're all kind of cynical, us Brits, aren't we? So what does it mean to do evangelism in a context of that level of distrust and cynicism about institutions, public bodies, information people are receiving? What is a British Christian going to do when we're going to the world and say, not only can you trust Christ, but you can trust me to tell you faithfully about what I've experienced of him? How do we overcome that? What does it mean for our challenge
really,
here?
really difficult, Gavin, right? Because you need, like you just said, we need to trust Christ and trust me there. But it works the opposite way in real life. You need to trust me so that you can trust Christ that I'm telling about. And this is really challenging in a context where there's really degraded and very low trust, not only in the West, but broadly in the world. You see really gut check facts about this, where, because of lack of trust, 86% of the globe in a huge international study said, really, I'm the source of what decides what is good and true and what is right and how I should act. This hyper individualism that happens, it's really difficult to say, well, yes, but Christ can tell you what's good, true, and beautiful, and should tell you what's good, true, and beautiful. That's a big wall to climb when 86% of the world doesn't agree with that. It's also very challenging when individuals, particularly youth, don't hold any trust in institutions, in the government, in the press, and unfortunately the church ranks right up there with them. Now, here's an opportunity, though, here, guys. There are some institutions that are still considered trustworthy. We're looking at universities and professors are considered trustworthy. Businesses are still considered trustworthy, and some NGOs. So in many cases where the pastor used to be the forefront of evangelism, now, gentlemen, it's those who are in the everyday life, the businessman, the professor, the artist, the creative, that are the leading, most trusted voices in evangelism. The word of God must be spread through all these people in the pew, and not just the pastor in a particular context.
And that's very encouraging, isn't it? In one sense, obviously, it's discouraging for those in the other fields. But we sort of live in an age where people are influencing, and one of the things we've been involved with is workplace evangelism, and obviously people having an influence where they are. I mean, I think one of the other themes that was quite interesting is not only are we obviously trusting ourselves, but there's been a sort of redefinition of what it means to be human, which has been influenced by the likes of technology and just a lot of this sort of I can decide my own identity, etc. I wondered if you could say anything a little bit about the challenges of that and what Christians can say in a world where actually the notions of what it means to be human are changing.
So there are 10 questions in the report that are shaping our world. And out of the 10 questions, while they're all incredibly important, I would have to say, particularly as the editor of the report, the number one question of our age is, what does it mean to be human? And this question is not just being asked in one direction. It's being interrogated from multiple directions, from AI to biotech to gender sexuality to morality and individualism. It's being interrogated from all these different directions, really calling the question, what does it mean to be human? Like I said, I believe this is the question of our age, right? In previous ages, it was who is Christ, right? What is the Trinity? But for our time, it's a Christian anthropology. What does it mean to be human? And so for all the individuals out there listening, saying, how is it that can work better in evangelism, work better? This is the question that we need to prep on. If we don't have an answer, and a convincing answer on what does it mean to be human from a Christian standpoint, if you can't rattle off and begin to talk about Christian anthropology with ease, we have some work to do. Because this is the fundamental question that everybody is asking, and will be the first barrier and the first door to opening to speak about who Christ is and what that means to your life.
If somebody's listening to this somewhere in the UK and thinks, I need to read this report, where can they actually get hold of it and have a dig into some of this stuff for themselves?
Yeah, very simple. Lausanne.org/report. And Lausanne is like Lausanne, Switzerland, LAUSANNE.org/report.
And will it cost them anything to get hold of it?
Lausanne produces everything free for anybody who wants it.
Wonderful. And there is a summary they can get of some of the key findings, isn't there? So that they don't have to, if someone says, I'm not going to read 500 pages, how can they get hold of your key findings so they could boil it down and maybe bring some of this to their own church in their own context?
Yeah, there's some great summaries on the website, as well as about 15-minute video of me speaking through the top findings of the report.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. And I mean, one of the interesting things is obviously it's not just looking at the state of play now. It's looking towards where the world is going. And I suppose one of the interesting observations is, of course, when you see trends, you sort of go, "Oh, that's where we're going to be in 2050." I suppose I'd be interested to know to what degree you think a report like this might potentially change those trends, because obviously you're also trying to galvanize the church and encourage them to do more mission, etc., to encourage all of us. So I'd be interested to know what is your hope for the report in terms of what you're wanting to come out of it, given that because you have these trends, it almost looks like, this is inevitable, this is going to happen.
Yeah, that's an amazing question there, Simon. The hope and the goal of the report is that this begins to introduce Christians to the active questions that are happening now. When we begin to do trend analysis, we're not making things up that what could be. Everything that will happen in 2050 is currently on the desk, on the conversations, and in the documents right now. Unfortunately, Christians are often a little bit too late to the conversation to begin to shape it. So the whole goal of the report is to say, these are the conversations happening right now. Can Christians be involved? Can we shape it? And can we change that trajectory line there? And the answer is yes. If we get engaged, we begin to speak and be participants in shaping of our global world.
Wonderful. If somebody listening to this podcast thinks, I need to step up, what is one thing I can do to be more engaged with world mission? If someone, has had their head down and only serving their immediate context, what one thing can someone listening to this do to engage as part of the world church with the current state of the Great Commission and where we're up to?
Yeah, the report covers a wide variety of current realities and future realities. Not every person can handle everything. The document itself chronicles the current gaps in our Great Commission. So this is perhaps a challenge of the report. You're going to read it and say, well, you're not covering my area of interest. You're not covering my area of expertise. And that's the point, because we're covering things that nobody's an area of expertise or nobody's an area of particular interest right now, because it's a gap in what we're thinking. So if you can read through and choose one of the gaps and pray through it, understand, ask how this is affecting your organization. If we have all these gaps and everybody takes one or so, we can begin to advance the conversation a little further.
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
Thank you. And sorry if I'm allowed one more question as well. You
we'll
mentioned
get one more in there. Okay.
Thank you. You mentioned what it is to be human and all those kind of questions. Again, I think some Christians perhaps may not have thought about that. Could you give a couple of pointers of how we can get good answers to those questions as Christians in a way that obviously we can use then to engage with people?
Yeah, I think this is where maybe the answer is not incredibly advanced. Maybe it's maybe very rote from what we've heard all in our lives in the church. Our answers probably shouldn't come from digital algorithmic content that gets delivered to us. The answers should probably be in our church community, in our scripture reading, in our catechesis, in understanding these core theological positions, that we can understand first principles first, who God is and how that works, and then work that in and through our context within our Christian communities to kind of develop these answers that are there. So it's not a radically new answer. It's actually a very traditionally old answer, but that's where the core of our foundation is and should be.
That's wonderful. We could discuss this for hours, but that's given us a really wonderful snapshot into where we're up to. Of course, in Acts chapter 1, Jesus says that we're to take the gospel from Jerusalem, Judea, and to the ends of the earth. And we're not there yet. There's much more work to do. You know, we used to have a missionary Sunday every year in my church. We always used to end it by singing that famous old hymn, "Facing a task unfinished that drives us to our knees. A need that undiminished rebukes our slothful ease. We who rejoice to know thee, renew before thy throne the solemn pledge we owe thee to go and make thee known." And we used to sing that every year on the Missionary Sunday, and we need to keep singing it still because the work is yet unfinished. So thank you, Matthew, for giving us a snapshot into where we are today. Folks, the link to get that report will be in the show notes, so you can download that and have a dig into it. The executive summary on the front end will give you the key findings to take to your church as we seek to honor Christ and to make him known throughout this world. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another PEP Talk, another guest where we'll continue to talk about honoring Christ and taking his Great Commission seriously and his gospel to the world. Thank you for listening, and goodbye.